In a small but prosperous village, Dan was a man of great wealth and influence. His riches were known far and wide, and he lived in luxury, enjoying all the comforts that money could buy. However, more than his wealth, there was something else. Dan loved even more women. Dan had an insatiable desire for female companionship. Whenever he laid eyes on a woman he admired, he would shower her with gifts: gold, jewelry, fine clothes, and anything she desired. Because of his wealth, women came to him easily, smiling and flirting, knowing that being with Dan meant a life of comfort. He never hesitated to indulge his desires, and soon his reputation as a woman lover spread throughout the village. His first wife, Ataku, the strong-willed woman. Dan's first wife was Ataku, a strikingly beautiful woman with sharp eyes and a strong spirit. Unlike many women who fell for Dan's wealth, Ataku was different. She was not easily swayed by riches or sweet words. She had a fire inside her that made people respect and fear her in equal measure. In the village, Ataku was known for her stubbornness and unshakable will. She spoke her mind without hesitation and commanded authority wherever she went. When she was angry, her eyes burned like fire, and her words could cut deeper than a blade. Even the men in the village were careful not to cross her. But despite her fierce personality, she loved Dan deeply. She bore him children and took care of their home with diligence. However, there was one thing about Dan that she hated: his wandering eyes. No matter how much Ataku loved Dan, she could never change his nature. He was never satisfied with one woman. His love for variety kept pulling him away, making Ataku feel as though she was never enough. She endured it for a while, but inside her, a storm was brewing. His second wife, Aodi, the gentle and obedient one. Not long after his marriage to Ataku, Dan met Aodi, a woman of soft words and quiet grace. Unlike Ataku, who was fiery and outspoken, Aodi was the epitome of patience and submission. She was gentle in her speech and moved with an elegance that made Dan fall for her instantly. Aodi never complained, never argued, and always did as she was told. She was the perfect contrast to Ataku, and Dan found comfort in her peaceful nature. But Ataku saw Aodi as weak. She believed that a woman should stand up for herself, not quietly accept everything. So when Aodi joined their household, Ataku made her life miserable. She gave her endless chores, treated her like a servant, and made sure she knew her place as the second wife. Aodi, however, never fought back. She simply endured, hoping that one day Dan would step in and defend her. But Dan didn't care about the fights between his wives. His eyes were already searching for his next conquest. His third wife, Neka, the bold and fearless woman. Dan's search for beauty and excitement led him to Neka, a woman unlike any he had met before. She was young, bold, and fearless, qualities that made her impossible to control. Unlike Aodi, who obeyed without question, Neka was unapologetically rebellious. She refused to be treated like a lesser wife and had no patience for Ataku's authority. If Ataku spoke sharply to her, Neka would speak back just as sharply. If she was given a chore she didn't want to do, she would refuse outright. Her confidence and bold personality made Dan obsessed with her. He adored her, spoiled her, and gave her anything she asked for. She quickly became his favorite, which angered both Ataku and Aodi. For Ataku, it was an insult. She had always been the strongest and most dominant in the house, but now, Neka threatened her place. For Aodi, it was just another reminder that Dan would always chase after something new, leaving her behind in the shadows. With Neka's arrival, the household became a battlefield. Ataku fought to keep her dominance, Neka fought to take control, and Aodi suffered in silence. Meanwhile, Dan was completely oblivious to the growing resentment among his wives. His mind was already wandering again. His fourth wife, Tashi, the beauty that changed everything. Then came Tashi, the woman who would change everything. She was the kind of beauty that made people stop and stare. Tall, with smooth skin that glowed like polished clay, and a smile that could melt even the coldest hearts, Tashi was the definition of perfection. Dan saw her once and was immediately captivated. He wasted no time. Within days, he had married her and brought her home, adding her to his collection of wives. But Tashi was different from the rest. She was not just beautiful, she was smart. She knew how to win favor, how to make people adore her, and most importantly, how to control Dan's heart. At first, she played the role of the obedient wife, watching and learning from the household drama. She saw how Adaku ruled with an iron fist, how Aote suffered in silence, and how Neka fought for power. But Tashi had no interest in fighting. She had a bigger plan. Tension and jealousy, a house divided. With 4 wives in the same household, jealousy and resentment grew like wildfire. Adaku hated how Dan kept bringing in new women. No matter how much she tried to control the house, she couldn't control his insatiable desire for more wives. Aote had lost all hope of ever being truly loved. She knew she would always be the forgotten one, the wife who was only there to serve. Neka refused to let anyone, especially Tashi, outrank her. She believed she was the boldest, the strongest, and that Tashi had no right to take her place. Tashi, however, had her own silent ambitions. She knew that the real power wasn't in fighting, it was in winning Dan's heart completely. Each wife had her own anger, pain, and secret plans, and Dan, blind to it all, continued living in his fantasy of wealth and endless women. But little did he know his greed and carelessness had set the stage for his own downfall. Dan's household, once filled with luxury and indulgence, had become a ticking time bomb. His 4 wives, Adaku, Aote, Neka, and Tashi, were no longer just coexisting. They were scheming, plotting, and preparing for war. The moment Tashi entered the household, she became Dan's new obsession. He showered her with riches, jewelry, fine clothes, and anything her heart desired. It didn't take long before she replaced Neka as his favorite. For Adaku, this was an unbearable insult. As the first wife, she had endured Dan's infidelity for years, watching him bring in new women while she struggled to maintain her authority. But now, she saw something she had never seen before. Dan was slipping away from her completely. For Neka, it was humiliation. She had fought to secure her place as Dan's most beloved wife, but Tashi had stolen that title with nothing but her beauty and charm. Neka had relied on her boldness to keep Dan's attention, but now she felt powerless against the effortless grace of the new wife. For Aote, life had always been about endurance. She had accepted her fate as the quiet, forgotten wife, but even she could see that the balance of power had shifted. And power struggles in a house like this never ended peacefully. And for Tashi, it was all going according to plan. For the first time, Adaku and Aote, who had once been bitter enemies, found themselves on the same side. Adaku, who had tormented Aote for years, now realized that Tashi was a greater threat. She couldn't control Dan anymore, but maybe, just maybe, she could still control who Dan loved. One night, Adaku approached Aote. They sat in the dim glow of an oil lamp, whispering in hushed voices. "We need to get rid of her," Adaku said, her voice laced with bitterness. Awu looked up, startled. "Tashi?" she asked. Adaku nodded. "She's dangerous. She's making Dan forget all of us. If we let her stay, she will take everything." Aote hesitated. She had never been one for schemes, but she had suffered under Adaku for too long to trust her easily. "What do you want me to do?" she asked cautiously. Adaku leaned closer, her voice dripping with persuasion. "We can't fight her directly. Dan is too blinded by her beauty. But we can distract him." "How?" Adaku smirked. "By giving him another woman." It was a brilliant yet sinister plan. They knew that Dan's weakness was his endless hunger for new women. If they could find someone even more beautiful than Tashi, his attention would shift once again, and Tashi would be pushed aside. After days of searching, Aote remembered a woman named Tashi, from a neighboring village. Tashi was stunning, even more beautiful than Neka, and with a charm that made men weak in the knees. She was tall, with skin as smooth as polished clay and eyes that held a mysterious glow. "She's perfect," Oh whispered, excitement creeping into her voice. Adaku's eyes gleamed. They knew Dan would fall for her instantly. Together, they approached Tashi, offering her riches, comfort, and the promise of becoming the most powerful wife in Dan's household. Tashi, eager for wealth, agreed immediately. The trap was set. Everything went exactly as Adaku and Aote had planned. Dan laid eyes on Tashi one evening at the palm wine stall, and within days he married her and brought her home as his fourth wife. But while Adaku and Aodi celebrated their victory, someone else was furious. Neka. She saw how easily Dan forgot about her, how quickly his eyes shifted to the next woman, and rage filled her heart. But Tashi, who had stolen Neka's place, wasn't going to let anyone steal hers. One day, Tashi saw Dan talking to another woman in the marketplace. They were laughing. His hand brushed against hers. A dark seed of suspicion took root in Tashi's mind. Is he planning to marry another one? She thought, her heart pounding with fury. That night, she followed him. She watched as he spoke with the woman, whispering and smiling. She saw the way his eyes lingered on her, the way his hands gently touched her face. Tashi snapped. She wouldn't let him do to her what he had done to Adaku, Aodi, and Neka. She had to stop him. So she waited. And then, when Dan was vulnerable when he was asleep in her bed, she took a blade. And she cut off his manhood. Tashi thought she had won. She thought that by taking away his manhood, she had taken away his ability to chase more women. But she was wrong. Because the woman Dan had been speaking to in the market, she wasn't another lover. She was his sister. The village awoke to screams. It was Aneka who first discovered Dan's lifeless body, sprawled across the floor in Tashi's chamber. His hands and legs were bound, his clothes were stained with blood, and his manhood was gone. Gasps and cries filled the air as the wives and villagers rushed into the room. Adaku stood frozen, her face drained of color. O trembled in silent horror. Neka's eyes burned with shock and rage. Dan's friends, who had come looking for him that morning, untied his weakened body. But it was too late. Dan was alive barely, but the once powerful, woman-loving man now lay broken and bleeding, his face pale from the loss of blood. The room was filled with chaos, disbelief, and fury. But as people scrambled to process the nightmare in front of them, their attention turned to Tashi. She stood in the doorway, calm, silent, and unbothered. Then she spoke. "Yes, I did it," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. Gasps spread through the crowd. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "I did it because I couldn't take it anymore." Dan couldn't stop. One wife, 2, 3, and still he wanted more. Even after marrying me, he was ready to bring another woman into this house. Tashi's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. I watched him whisper to her, touch her face. I knew he would bring her here, just like the rest of us. I couldn't allow it. Not again. A heavy silence settled over the crowd. Then Adaku spoke, her voice laced with both fear and anger. "You fool." Tashi turned her sharp gaze toward the first wife. That woman was his sister. The world seemed to stop. Tashi's breath hitched. Her eyes darted between Adaku and Neka, searching for signs of deception. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." But the truth was clear. The woman she had seen with Dan was not another lover. She was his own blood. Tashi's knees nearly buckled. She had acted in a moment of blind jealousy and rage, and she had destroyed Dan for nothing. But the horror wasn't over yet, because what came next would shake the entire village to its core. Dan was carried away to be treated, but the damage was irreversible. The crowd, still reeling from the revelation, turned their attention back to Tashi. They demanded answers. They demanded to know what she had done with the severed part. Tashi's lips curled into a bitter smile. And then she delivered the words that sent a wave of sickness and dread through every soul present. "You all ate it." A moment of silence. Then screams, cries, people retching onto the ground. Women clutched their stomachs. Men recoiled in horror. The children, confused, looked around in panic. Neka staggered backward. "What do you mean we ate it?" Tashi's eyes darkened. "I made soup with it." The words landed like a death sentence. Adaku doubled over and vomited on the floor. Aodi covered her mouth, her hands shaking violently. Dan's friends, who had come for him earlier, were now running outside, retching onto the grass. Everyone who had enjoyed the delicious meal Tashi had prepared that morning realized what they had truly consumed. Dan's manhood. The once fearsome and powerful Don was gone. The wives who had fought and schemed for power were now prisoners of their own actions. And the village, disgusted and horrified, demanded justice. The elders gathered to determine the fate of those involved. Tashi, the one who committed the crime, was to be banished immediately. Ataku and Aodi, who had conspired to bring Tashi into Dan's life, were also held accountable. Even Neka, though innocent in this final act, had played a role in the destruction of Dan's household through her endless fights for dominance. The verdict was clear. All three wives, Tashi, Adaku, and Aodi, were to be cast out of the village. No home, no riches, no protection. Their fate was to wander the lands, carrying the shame of their deeds. Dan, though alive, would never be the same. His once lavish and indulgent life had ended in humiliation and agony. The man who had once ruled his household with wealth and desire had lost everything: his strength, his wives, his pride. His children, now fatherless, would be raised by relatives. The house that had once been filled with laughter, jealousy, and love now stood quiet, abandoned, and cursed. The story of Dan and his wives spread far beyond the village. It became a warning for generations to come, a tale of greed, jealousy, betrayal, and the deadly consequences of unchecked desire. And so, Dan, the wealthy man who loved women too much, became a legend. A tragic one,